I recently began playing a campaign with a group of players, and I wanted to start doing review videos about what our sessions were like in case other dungeon masters want to run the same session or want to run the same campaign and are looking for resources on how to run it. The campaign that we're running is an old school Dungeons & Dragons module, B4, The Lost City. Now, I am very, very excited to run this module because this was the module that I learned how to play Dungeons & Dragons on a few years back, and it holds a lot of nostalgia for me. Back in middle school when I learned it was a lot of fun exploring the pyramid, which is basically the dungeon in this adventure, and finding out more about what was in the different levels of that pyramid. So I was very excited when my group decided that this is what we were going to play starting in January of this year. Now, I gave myself, before we started playing, a few requirements just to make sure that we were going to be able to play the module and we wouldn't get bogged down with all the craziness in life that seems to be happening. The first of those requirements is I wanted to make sure that this was an open table game. In other words, I wanted to make sure that anybody who wanted to come and play could, and anybody who couldn't wouldn't, and it wasn't a big deal. So to do this, I invited as many people as I could find that wanted to play Dungeons & Dragons, and at this point we have about 10 people in the group, and on any given week anybody can show up, and if they can't make it, that's just fine. One of the challenges, though, with running an open table campaign is that in general it's helpful to have a common starting place and a common stopping place at the end of any given session, because if character A is there for the first session but not there for the second session, and those the starting place and stopping place are different than maybe character B, who was not there for the first session and who was there for the second session, it's hard to kind of reconcile those different locations, especially after you go session after session after session with different characters dropping in and out. So for an open table campaign to work, I figured that we could have a safe room inside this pyramid that the characters would be exploring to make sure that they would always start the adventure there and end the adventure there. Another thing that I really wanted to make sure that we ran was I wanted to make this a very low prep game. I didn't want to have to do a lot of prep in between sessions because that was one of the things that prevented me from being able to run games in the past. Now, the Lost City is basically a mega dungeon crawl in the form of a pyramid, and that makes it very, very easy for a low prep game to be run. I did prepare a few resources, and I'll give you a link down below to the document. You can download for free if you're looking to run a similar game as mine, and that has made it very, very easy for me to prep for each session. It takes about 5 or 10 minutes depending on what happened the session before. And then finally, my players voted to run this game in 5th edition. I would have preferred it to be run in Advanced Dungeons & Dragons because that was how the module was intended. However, 5th edition is just fine. And one of the things I did before we started the campaign is I sat down and I just transcribed the monsters from this module to their counterparts in the 5th edition monster manual. Some of the monsters don't have an exact one-to-one example from 2nd edition over to 5th edition, and I found the best substitute. For example, there is a lizard in this module that is called Draco. I couldn't find the other type of the Draco of the monster manual in the 5th edition monster manual, and so instead I used what did I use? I used a basilisk, but instead of using gaze to turn the players to stone, I used a poison bite to turn the players to stone, or at least give them paralysis. And so that was my process. I have an open table campaign going where the players will be starting and stopping at a safe place after each session. I have a document, which I'll be going over briefly to kind of help me prep for each session and be ready. And then I transcribed the monsters and the traps and everything else from the module into 5th edition. And that ended up not taking a whole bunch of time. Maybe I sat down for an hour and just kind of with both books side by side and started writing in the columns of the module. So I'm going to go ahead and grab my my handouts and I'll start with my introduction. So before we started playing, I really wanted to make sure, like I said, that I had very little prep going on for this particular adventure. And the very first thing I did is I wanted to sit down and look at the Wandering Monster tables in the Lost City B4 module. The Wandering Monster tables are actually very good. I think they are a lot of the monsters, excuse me, that you are taking a look at and encountering within the module are not purely combat focused. There is a incredibly fun table of encounters involving the Synedicians, the relatively passive and drugged up people within the pyramid, and they're hilarious and fun, and there's a lot of different role-playing opportunities that don't involve combat. There are also a few other monsters that you can encounter where combat is not the most dangerous thing that's going to be happening. For example, in tier 1 or tier 2 of the pyramid, you can encounter a cave locust, and cave locusts pack a punch if they hit you, but it's not, the chances aren't great that they're going to hit you. However, they are loud, and cave locusts can attract other monsters, and that's their real danger, not the damage, but attracting other monsters. So what I did is I basically used the wandering monster table from the different tiers of the pyramid, and I added them to my own. I used most of the examples from the module. What I did is I took a few of the monsters out. For example, I think in tier 3 of the module, there is a cave ferret, and I knew that if my players encountered a cave ferret, they would probably, the things would go off the rails. And so I realized that, hey, you know what, a cave ferret may not be the best monster for my group. And so I made a substitution. There's another one in tier 4, I think they can encounter a white ape, and that just seems completely out of place in an underground pyramid lost in the desert. So I took that out and replaced it with something else. So I made some basic substitutions, but otherwise I used the random encounters from the module as written. But the thing that I added down on the bottom is the encounter proximity. So anytime the characters have an encounter, a random encounter, I also roll a d6 to indicate encounter proximity, and this allows for each encounter not just to be about combat. I really wanted to run this pyramid and this module as a little bit more lethal, and I wanted to give the sense that it's a living pyramid, that there's a whole lot going on within the pyramid. And a part of that, I wanted to make sure that there was a lot of encounters. But if there's a lot of encounters that have a lot of combat, sometimes it's hard to get anything done on any given session. So I added this encounter proximity table to make sure that every encounter didn't just revolve around combat. So when an encounter occurs, I roll a d6, and if it's a 6, that means the proximity is far away, which means that the characters don't actually have an encounter. Rather, they see signs of an encounter. So they might see signs of a wild animal, or they might see a dead body from a skirmish, or something like that. If they roll a 4 or 5, they might encounter sounds of something coming, sounds of something leaving, sounds of combat somewhere else. And this does 2 things for the group. First, it provides another encounter that's not combat. It builds the tension of the pyramid. But second of all, it teaches the players that sound in the pyramid matters. If they're going to go around shooting off fireworks, which is something you can do, they're going to attract a lot of monsters. Whereas if they're going to sneak around, they're going to attract fewer. So sound matters. And then 3, 2, 1 get closer and closer as maybe they see something from far off, maybe they see something from around the corner, or maybe they turn the corner and then bam, they run into something. So that was the first thing I did, is I made a few additions and took a few things away from the Wandering Monster table, put it on a piece of paper, and added my encounter proximity. The next thing that I did was I made up a 1-pager for each of the main factions within the pyramid. So that would be the Brotherhood of Gorm, one of the main factions. That would be the Magi of Usamagaris, and that would be the Warrior Maidens of Madura. Now, what this 1-pager does is on the top half, I wanted it just to be an at-a-glance information, description, maybe some common sayings of that particular faction, so that it would help me role-play them better, who the leader was, and then, if needed, what their regular rank-and-file counterpart in the Monster Manual was. On the bottom, though, is something that's really, really important for the Lost City module, and it's something that I learned when I was researching how to run this module. The whole premise of the Lost City module is that the characters get lost in the desert, they're starving, they're dying of thirst, and they find this lost pyramid. They go inside because they have no other option to survive, and eventually they maybe find food, but more importantly, they find treasure. Now, if they're in the middle of a lost pyramid and they can't get out, the treasure is completely worthless unless there's already a financial ecosystem within the pyramid. And there is. That's where the factions come in. Each faction has some sort of lifeline, some sort of secret way to get down to the underground city, which is well beneath the earth, and that's where the rest of the Synedicians live. And from there, they can get resources and they can gather items and bring them back up to the pyramid, and that characters can pay for them. And so it's very important for the characters in this module to have at least somewhat of a neutral or positive relationship with at least one of the factions, so that they can sell their gems, sell their the other interesting things they find, and then buy things with the gold that they find within the pyramid. So at the bottom of each of these 1-pagers for each of the factions, I have the trading post. So this is the Brotherhood of Gorm trading post, equipment and offerings. And basically what I did is I just went to the player's handbook, took a chunk of items that seemed like it was Brotherhood of Gormy. So that would be the armor, a few weapons, a few other items, and doubled the price because, you know, they don't have unlimited resources here in the pyramid. And then said, hey, this is the cost. If you ever want to buy these things from the Brotherhood of Gorm, you can. I did the same thing with the Magi of Usamagaras and with some different items. And I did the same thing with the Warrior Maidens of Madura with some different items. And so here at this point, the different factions allow the players to spend money, buy rations if they need to, so they can actually survive, so they can actually take long rests. And essentially, they have an ecosystem that they can use their treasure that they find in. The last part of this, well, the second to last part of this little packet that I made is a faction event roll. This is something that I do at the end of each session. If the characters go out, meet a faction for that session, then after the session's over, I just roll on this table and it gives me an event that occurs or happens to that faction. So for example, if they roll a 1, if I roll a 1, the event might be a fire, which means one room in the faction somehow caught on fire and most of the things burned, which means that maybe supplies for that particular faction are unavailable next session. Each time that the characters then go and meet a faction again, something's happened, something new has happened, and it gives that sense of, hey, the pyramid is a living ecosystem again. It's not just a static dungeon where if you clear a room, it's going to be clear forever. Things are always moving, things are always evolving. The very last thing I did with this little packet is I made a milestone experience table. Now, what this is this is a list of milestones where if the characters hit, they get experience or rewards. So at the very least, I made sure that I wanted the characters to have an incentive to explore the pyramid. So if they're able to make it to the first tier of the pyramid, they get 30 experience. If they make it down to the second tier of the pyramid, they get 60 experience, and so on and so forth down the pyramid. And that structure has incentivized the players to explore deeper and deeper because, hey, they know they get that sweet XP out of it. The second thing I added was I wanted the characters to get experience for meeting the 3 main factions, the Brotherhood of Gorm, the Magi of Usamagaras, and the Warrior Maidens of Madura. Each of those results in 30 experience, but essentially what that does is not only does it allow the characters to gain experience, but it means that, hey, we have to at least play nice with these factions because, especially at first level, those factions would win quickly in any major battle, and so it allows the characters to go in with a mindset of diplomacy rather than one of combat. And then finally, one of the things that I wanted to make sure the characters did is I wanted them to be in charge of making their own map. I wanted them to be in charge of doing the write-ups at the end of the adventure. And so I gave rewards to those different jobs, I guess. +2 to search rolls if the characters help make a map, and +2 to a skill choice of the player's turn and inspiration if they do a session summary. And then that way the players are incentivized to do a write-up for what their characters experienced. And that is another important part of an open table game, because that way a player who misses a session or two can still stay up to date with what's been explored inside the pyramid. So again, this is what I have built for this particular adventure, this module, and this has helped me reduce the amount of prep time that I've needed. It's helped incentivize my players to kind of do the fun things in the pyramid, and it's allowed the open table style game at least to work so far. So again, that's this. I'm going to put that a link to this. You can download it free down below, and I'm going to move on a little bit with what I'm talking about. So the very first thing we did after, as a group, after I did all my prep in that packet, was we had our session 0. And here we created characters. Everybody kind of went through and did what they needed to, and we ended up with a party. Now, it's interesting, at this point we have 10 players, but not every player has created a character yet, because not every player has had a chance to play yet. So the characters that have been created are Kandor, who is a human cleric, Rogar, who is a dragonborn paladin, Peros, who is a rogue halfling, Ronarash, who is a barbarian half-orc, Ferric, who is a cleric dwarf, and Koranacht, who is an elf rogue. And those were the characters that was created. And then there's one other resource I made real quick. I'll also include it down below if you want to check it out. And it was basically a quick way for characters to make connections between one another. So basically it had 2 different lists. Both lists were D12s, and you would roll on the list and it would give you a prompt and say, determine which other character is a relative of yours or is a cousin of yours that you saw at family events when you were younger. And it's a way for the characters to make these small connections between them, and maybe even give them a reason why they're crossing the desert in the first place. And then at the end of session 0, we started playing. And so I gave the whole spiel that's laid out in the beginning of the Lost City, the B4 module, where the characters are on a caravan, gets lost in the desert, they're starving, they're dying of thirst, they've left everything behind except what they need, and they find a pyramid. They go inside, and the characters were able to basically get through the first room, get through the second room, and they found their safe room. And so that's where we ended session 0 after a quick combat and a quick trap opportunity that they avoided. And so session 0 is over with a safe room in the pyramid, and we were ready for session 1. Now, in session 1, I had a group of 4 that began to explore the pyramid. This was Ferric, Ronarash, Rogar, and Koranacht. And they had a choice because their safe room actually had 3 doors. There was 2 doors on the west wall and 1 door on the east wall, and they weren't sure where to go. And it was very interesting watching them. This is the very first real exploration they were going to be doing inside the pyramid, and it took them about 10 minutes to figure out which door they wanted to choose. So they chose the 1 door on the east wall, and it led to a hallway. And so they began exploring the east side of this. This was the second tier of the pyramid, and they were continuing to use that rule. And I forgot what the rule is called, but the idea is that you always turn one direction. So you go right, and then right, and then right, and then right, and then right, until you can't go right anymore. And then you backtrack, and then you take the next path, the next furthest one to the right. And so this worked out. Now, there's an interesting thing that happens in the beginning of the Lost City. The tension that's set up, especially in the way my campaign worked at the end of session 0, is that everybody is starving and nobody can take a long rest, nobody has rations, and they need to find food fast. That tension disappears as soon as the characters find the Brotherhood of Gorm. And that was the very first room that these characters opened. It was the Brotherhood of Gorm. So imagine their surprise when they open the door and inside are 6 men-at-arms just hanging out inside the pyramid. What does that say? Well, number 1, it says that, hey, there's people living in the pyramid. And number 2, it means that there's food nearby. So the characters get to talking. They are led to the leader of the Brotherhood of Gorm. They get the history of the Synedicians, the history of the pyramid, the history of the Brotherhood of Gorm. They find out who Zargon is. And one of the characters decides that they want to become a member of the Brotherhood of Gorm. They go through a trapdoor down to the tier 3 of the pyramid and do the initiation ceremony, come back up, and they're initiated as a member and now have purchasing privileges within the Brotherhood. They buy some rations, everyone feels good, and then the leader says, you know what would really help us is if you went out into the pyramid and you started clearing out some of the evil things and monsters in the rooms, because guess what? Every single week, someone doesn't come back and we're assuming it's from these monsters. And so that's what the group does. They start exploring the rest of the top level of this pyramid, I guess the second tier of the pyramid. They go and they find a room with some salamanders, which they're able to take apart pretty quickly, and a few of the more industrious characters decide to cut apart the salamanders and keep it as food, which ended up helping them later in a different session, very much so. They ended up going to a room and they found a room full of pixies. Now, this was interesting because the leader of the Brotherhood of Gorm had explained that there are other factions within the pyramid, the Magi and the Warrior Maidens, and the characters all thought that these pixies were the Magi of Usimagaris, but they weren't. And so the pixies are written to be aloof and joyful and merry, but aloof is the word that I keyed on. And so it was interesting to watch the characters try and find out about the Magi of Usimagaris from these pixies who could barely hold the conversation for more than 6 words. Eventually, the characters realize that the pixies are sitting on crates. They look at what's in the crates, and there are fireworks. So the dwarf, Ferric, decides he's going to try and trade some ball bearings for a firework, and it works. Fairies love, or pixies, I should say, love marbles. Ronarash, the half-orc, decides to do the same, and they walk out of there with 2 fireworks. They go to explore another room, and they find some green slime. Now, this was interesting because this was one of the first encounters that was more old school than what these players were used to. I had described to the players before the game started that in 5th edition, a lot of encounters are balanced. When you go into combat, oftentimes in 5th edition, the understanding is that winning combat is possible, plausible. I said this module is somewhat balanced, but it's not nearly as balanced as 5th edition. So you're going to go into combat encounters that you're going to win quickly, and you're going to go into combat encounters that will result in a total party kill if you're not careful. And so this was one of those examples. They walked in, they saw the green slime, they didn't step on it, that was smart. One of them put a javelin into the green slime just to see, poke it to see what it was, and the javelin started corroding. And then, of course, the green slime animated and started attacking. The closest character that got hit saw that when their armor was hit, it started corroding away, and that scared the characters. It's interesting to see that bodily harm to their characters doesn't matter. However, if their things start getting destroyed, they start getting scared. So they slammed the door and ran away, which I think was smart, because in my opinion, that was a very difficult combat for them to potentially survive. They continue exploring, and they walk into another room and find the back door to the treasure of the Brotherhood of Gorm, but responding to the wishes of the leader, they stay away from it, mostly because they know that it's guarded by angry bees. And then they find, finally, the stairs down to the lower level. Now, at this point, they went down there. They gained the experience from exploring. This would be the third tier of the pyramid. And they walked down the hallway until they found an interesting room. You see, the room was a hallway, but next to the door on either side was a panel that looked like elevator buttons, but of course the buttons were in a different language. Now, this is maybe the most clever but also the most annoying thing about this module, and it's called the revolving passage. And the idea is each one of those buttons, basically they're buttons, each one of those buttons responds to a cardinal direction. So if you go into the hallway and you hit one of the buttons, maybe the west button, what will happen is the hallway will rotate until the door that you're closest to faces west. The far door of the hallway will then face east, and then you'll be able to access the door to the west. Same thing if you hit the button that refers to north or south or southeast or southwest, etc. And that's how that works. Well, the characters didn't quite know what to make of it. However, what they did do is they did a quick rubbing of charcoal on paper of those symbols and brought it back up to the Brotherhood of Gorm. The Brotherhood of Gorm, of course, knew what that was all about and explained it to them. And that's where we ended the session. And so session 1 ended with the first tier of the pyramid. That was just the entrance room. They had already been down. They explored the whole second tier of the pyramid that they could find. They missed a few things. And they're ready now to explore the third tier of the pyramid because now they know how the revolving passage works. So my plan here is to continue giving you updates every few sessions just to tell you how it's going, tell you what I've learned from running the Lost City, in hopes that if you plan to run the Lost City at some point in the future, you can learn something from me and from my mistakes and perhaps my players' successes. So thanks for watching, and we'll see you in the next video.